Welcome. It's nice to see you all. Hello, I'm Andrew Taylor. I'm in the faculty of the Arts Management program here at American University, and we're going to have a conversation about artistic leadership, particularly the search and support for new artistic leadership in American nonprofit theater. And as we begin all things, I want to make sure we acknowledge, I'm going to do this myself because it's right here, that we are located on the territories of the Piscataway, Powhatan, and Nanticoke peoples. And as organizers of this event, we recognize our ability to gather here is due to the continued occupation of this land. We also recognize many enslaved and indentured people were forced to dedicate their labor to the construction of what is now Washington, D.C. To these people and their descendants, we acknowledge their indelible mark on the space in which we will gather for this event. And lastly, in recognition that this land is colonized indigenous territory that has been crafted through slave and indentured labor, it's our collective responsibility here and always to critically interrogate the histories and afterlives of these events and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. And I hope the conversation today is in part living some of the promises we make by saying that out loud, because if you don't actually do anything, you might as well not say it. So we're going to try our best to live the values we're putting here. So for those joining us online, welcome on HowlRound, on Zoom, wherever you happen to be. For those in the room, welcome. I'm really excited to have these extraordinary professionals in the room with us. And I think I'm just going to start with having you each just say a little bit about what your job is. Like if you had to explain artistic director of a theater to somebody who didn't know what an artistic director of a theater did, I would love for each of you to give that lens. And then you as well. Let's start with Hana Sharif, who's joining us from Arena Stage.
Hi.
Hey. That was a lot of fun.
How's everybody feeling tonight? We'll call and respond. Warm the room up a little bit. So I'm artistic director at Arena Stage, and I think the question is, what does an artistic director do? Good question. So I will say that there are different models of artistic directors. I have a somewhat traditional artistic practice. I'm both a playwright, a director, and a producer, right? So I call myself a generative, interpretive, and curatorial artist. And as artistic director, I'm the lead artist at the institution. I curate all of the seasons, so I choose all of the plays that one sees. I hire all of the teams. And what I say is that artistic director, and I'm also very hands-on in the running of the company, which again, there are different models and across generations. Some artistic directors were less involved in the actual running of the theater or the model that supports the work. But for me, I don't know how to do this work without understanding the kind of fiscal reality of the organization and how all of the threads of what we do come together. Artistic directors also are often lead fundraisers for the institution. I spend a lot of time raising money for the art and for the artists. I am responsible for actualizing the mission and creating the blueprint for the vision of the organization. It is an incredibly important job. All of the threads of the organization, I always say that in a theater, you do one of two things. You're either in the business of making theater or selling theater. And what kind of theater, how you do that work, how you serve your community is through the vision of the artistic director. So it is an incredibly important job. And in the American theater, uniquely compared to the museum world or the symphony world or the opera world, most of our nonprofit regional theaters have a two-person executive leadership team of equals. And that is different. You go into the symphony world, there's usually an executive director who has kind of final say. But in the traditional nonprofit theater, you often see an artistic director and a managing director. And the managing director has fiscal responsibility to support the vision of the artistic director. And you work very closely hand in hand. And when it's a great marriage, it means that wonderful things happen for your institution. And when it is not, it means you have to work really hard to make it a great marriage so that wonderful things happen for your institution.
It's beautiful. So you can see how hard it is to find and secure extraordinary leadership that does all that. And maybe I'm going to pivot to Reg before I go to you, because we want to see if Reginald Douglas, who's here from Mosaic Theater, is also artistic director.
I would say
disagree.
Hana says, and I think just a yes and to everything Hana says about the marriage, about the partnership. about being the one who both has the vision and helps implement it or leads it. I think for Mosaic, we're uniquely and purposely, where I say we're intentionally leaning into our biggest of the small and smallest of the big, unique opportunity here in Washington, D.C., where there's a robust theater and cultural scene. Mosaic, we're thinking deeply, particularly as we head into our 10th anniversary next year, the third under my leadership, about how do we actualize our resources to the best of our ability to serve artists and audience as well as our staff. I sometimes find that the three of those constituents can fall out of whack a bit. And we've worked really intentionally to build the right team structure to then support the artists, help us then grow the audience to be reflective of what we are and what even more so we could be.
Very cool. And Al Heartley, who's here from Atlanta, does many things, management consulting included, but I wanted to, his role, at least today, is focusing on the search consultant portion of his job. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about what a search consultant does in support of executive or artistic leadership?
Absolutely. You know, I feel like you all can maybe tell me what a search consultant does more than I can, but only because really I tripped into this work. So my name's Al Heartley. I'm a partner and a co-founder at a firm called Evolution Management Consultants, where we really center equity, diversity, inclusion, and access within our work, authenticity within our work, to do both search and management and planning for theater and nonprofit organizations. But specifically with search, especially how both Hana and Reginald have described the artistic director role. So much of my journey is working to find folks within the field who want to occupy these positions of artistic director or executive director. So usually whenever someone like a Hana leaves or like Reginald leaves their post of an executive leadership position, often boards will hire or will form a search committee that is tasked with finding the next artistic leader or the next executive leader. And in order to do that and facilitate that process, some search committees choose to do it completely on their own in terms of actually putting out a job description, finding candidates and interviewing them, ultimately making a recommendation to the board for who to hire. Rather than some organizations doing that themselves, they choose to hire a search consultant to say, you know, you're really the party and so to speak, the expert in terms of this role in finding who are the players or who are the people that are interested in this kind of job, identifying the skill sets and the needs within the organization around leadership and what is needed out of a leader. And then being able to design what I less call a search, but a journey. I think that each, in my own artistic way, each leadership search is a kind of journey for a question that an organization is asking itself in this moment. So my job is to design that journey. What are the questions that are obvious to think about? And then frankly, what are the questions that are not being asked and thought about? And how do you put that at the forefront?
Beautiful. So, okay. So we have someone who tends to represent the sort of board or the search committee. And then we have two people, one very recently in their new position, one been there for a little bit. And that's our exploration today, is thinking about, well, how does this process either facilitate or not facilitate the availability of these leadership roles for a diverse set of voices and perspectives? Because if you look over the history of professional nonprofit theater, you don't see a lot of diversity at the top level, and we're just starting to see that now. So I love the idea of a journey. I was going to frame it in a little bit more maybe awkward way, because I'm not as elegant, is sort of is essentially the 4 steps of a problem solving. Like, let's say your artistic director is leaving or has left. You as a governing board are responsible for the health and vitality of the organization. You have a problem, right? And maybe it's opportunity. So it's not always a problem. You guys are not solving a problem, but let's frame it that way, just so we can use sort of the problem solving steps and think about each of them, and I'm try and pace ourselves to see if we can make it through. But essentially, first you have to define the problem you have and formulate what exactly it is you're facing. So we'll think of that in the search as about, well, what does the job description look like? What is the kind of the ways we're thinking about? What does our next leader need to know or do or have capacity to do? Who are we, and how can our leader reflect and amplify that? The second is you have to generate alternatives, right? So we've shaped a job search idea. we have to find candidates in the world. How do we look? How do we draw a circle that includes people that might not have otherwise shown up in traditional or conventional lists? The third is the decision making, right? So now we've got it down to a short list. We need to actually talk to these people, make a decision about which of these candidates that are our finalists are the ones that fit, and how are they going to know us? And finally, we have to implement and adapt. So let's make the choice. We've hired somebody, they've agreed to join us, they're now in the organization. Now we have to see what happened. And each of those, to me, that translates also into the onboarding and support of a new artistic leader, and the way they either are able to manifest the change that everybody talked about during the process, or they are not able to manifest the change because the organization wasn't actually ready to change. So that's the way I want to talk about this, if that makes sense. And again, it's not problem and solution, but I find it's a frame. So let's think about first, and again, from the search consultant and from your own experience in the search process, the problem formulation. So how good are nonprofit professional theater boards at describing what they need in artistic leadership? Is that something that's good?
It does. I just have my spirits on. I think problem is not a useful noun here. I think opportunity is far more useful.
Great.
Because I wouldn't be attracted to, and I don't think many candidates would be attracted to, hi, come fix us. Or hi, there's a problem, will you be the savior? And you can suss that out pretty quickly, I think, in a conversation, particularly when you get deeper into the search process. And so I've been drawn to searches and ultimately drawn to the position at Mosaic, where there is a spirit of opportunity in the room. So yes, there may be some real problems, or the opportunity arises because of past problems. But I think, especially on the artistic leadership position, that it's important that that board, or that candidate, or that staff, or that search committee, but that the people, the constituents at play, are looking for more than answers to the problems that have existed, and are actually excited about what could become from a new leader. And I think that spirit of a search is very important.
That's great.
So I just want to offer that from personal experience, and as we look at people who
all right, I fully accept the revision. Now we're talking about opportunity, description, and formulation, and there may also be problems in the mix that need to be engaged, but let's lead with opportunity and new potential.
Can I also give context before we dive in? I know this is not the starting point, but I think it's really important. So part of it is to understand that we are a field in evolution, right? And the last 5 years in particular, I would say 5 to 10 years, has been for our field warp speed evolution. So 20 years ago, there were basically 2 search firms that did 95% of the searches in the American theater. So there were only 2 firms. So if a job came open 20 to 30 years ago, a theater board would call the 2 search firms and would get an RFP and figure out which of the 2 they were going to go with. The other thing about the search experience 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, certainly it was this way 20 years ago, I can speak personally to it, is that the search firms were also somewhat hidden. So you didn't know until you were the right pedigree and they came for you, you didn't know who they were, right? So it's a little bit like these mysterious firms, right? So if you were not at a theater that had done a search and you had not been invited into a search, you didn't know who they were. And that was really interesting, because in order for that to stay secret, that meant that everyone in the American theater had to be complicit, right? So people who had been invited into the process and had been candidates were also keeping quiet about who the firms were, because that's what you were taught was supposed to happen, right? So what would happen is the search firms who were meant to be the professional keepers of talent would be the gatekeepers for access to executive leadership jobs, which meant if you were not on their radar, you were never going to be invited into a process, because for the most part, there also wasn't a public opportunity for you to submit yourself for a job, right? And so when enough people knew you and you made it to the short list, you would get this magical call from one of the 2 firms inviting you into the secret process of interviewing to become an executive leader. I wish this was not the truth. This is all true. These are facts, right? And I will give you this example. I was at a TCG conference and I was in a multi-generational BIPOC leaders room. And some of the younger folks were saying, I really want to submit myself for these jobs and I don't know where to go. And some of the older leaders were hush.
Mhm.
But I was with an organization that was going through a leadership shortage. So I knew who the two firms were. And so I said in the room who the two firms were. And a hush fell over the room. I had broken the cardinal rule, revealing to the masses who actually does the searches. And saying, I'm going to give email addresses so you can send your resumes in so they will know that you exist. Because the other thing that was happening, and I use this as an example, when I was at Hartford Stage, Michael Wilson was the artistic director. He transitioned out and we hired one of the two firms to do the search. I was the associate artistic director at the theater. I'd been at the theater at that point for 8 years. And I was not invited into the search. I was on the search committee. And when I had a conversation with the leader of the search about why halfway through the process, there had only been one woman who had been brought before the search committee that I was on, and no people of color, the search consultant looked at me and said, that's because there are no qualified people of color. And this is you've got the most qualified woman we could find. I was like, I'm an associate artist. Half the people you brought in the room are in the position that I'm in. Half of the people in your jobs are associate artistic directors. I am here, invisible, right? So this is 20 years ago. Now there was a breaking open that happened in the last 10 years, and Al, maybe, in terms of like just getting us up to speed.
Yeah.
There are many more firms, and there has been what I would say is a medium level of access. I think most people in the past would say it's radical access, because now most jobs will post who's running their search publicly. You can send your materials in to be considered by a search firm for most searches. And there is a mandate from most institutions to have a much more diverse pool of candidates. And so that has shifted the way we approach this question that you asked us. But I do think the context of understanding in the last 20 years that it was a very secret, very curated process by which only the people who, and both search firms had all male search consultants, right? So there were no women running searches. There were women working in the company, they were not running searches. There were no people of color in either of those companies. And so it's not a surprise that we have this kind of monolithic leadership, because they were the gatekeepers to determine who was qualified to be seen for those jobs. That has shifted in a profound way, but I just wanted us to have that context for this conversation.
And I think the important piece with, and I love this framing around opportunity and also the context of searches. I've been doing search work now for the past 5 years. And when Hana talks about the mysteriousness of not knowing either who the firms were, talk about having to start a firm and then figure out, what is this process that we go through? What is even the process of doing this? Because it sounds simple, right? You got a job opening, you do a job description, you get candidates, you talk about the candidates, you interview them, then you say, hey, you want this job? Yeah, maybe I do. You offer, negotiate, they come in, they're done. Simple framing, right? You hope that's it. And we're done.
That's not it.
That's not it. You come in when you ask about, do people know what to expect? I think my job as a search consultant is to reveal that opportunity and also reveal the organization. I think now, over the past 5 years, there's been an expectation of some level of more transparency.
Yes.
There's been an expectation of more diverse candidates within your pool so that it doesn't have a monolith. There's literally a blog or email list about the Game of Thrones of the American theater. Because what got me interested was saying, oh, this person has moved here, and this person has moved here, and this person's here, and now this search is open, and this person's going here from the artistic director position or the executive director position. So I felt like coming in, it was a job to say, how can I frame for the organization what the opportunity is, what their institutional history means in the context of this search, what the kind of art that they are making for their community and the history of that art making, and what does that mean for the kind of leader that you're trying to find out? And I think that kind of framing for organizations to say, I have a lot of institutional and historical knowledge about the regional theater field, but now coming into an organization and saying, tell me about yourself on your own terms. And usually when I'm going in to listen to an organization, I'm listening for two things: consistency and inconsistency, alignment and non-alignment. Where does the board have alignment about the kind of person that they're looking for? Because I'll tell you, and I'm sure that Hana and Reg have gone through this in some ways. You ask people what they want. I want someone who's strategic. I want someone who's operational. I want someone who's an artist. I want someone who can raise money. I want someone who knows how to market to their community. I want someone who knows about EDIA. I want someone who knows how to coach a staff. I want someone who knows how to expand. I want someone who knows how to grow. I'm like, my goodness, how do I make this word become flesh? And that's what you have to put in front of people and let people know, is to say, these are people, these are artists. Yes, who they are is really key, and some of the things that you want to bring in are really key. But I'm not here searching for unicorns, and I'm not here to give you a shiny object. And there's too many people and too many searches over the past 10 years who have just said, give me a shiny object, give me a Tony Award winner, give me someone who's won a Pulitzer Prize, give me someone who's a MacArthur Genius Grant person. What does that mean in terms of the organizational direction and the strategy of your organization moving forward? Yeah. That's the question in front of you.
I think what you've just said is really important, because if you're talking about the opportunity, the truth is most boards don't know what they're looking for, right? So when a leader says, I'm retiring, or I have another job and I have an opportunity, the impulse of most boards, if they have not selected for the leader to leave, which is most of the time not the way it happens. Usually it's a leader retiring or ascending to another position.
Right.
The board is like, what are we going to do? We need someone just like the person we had, right? And part of what I think is so important about the search, and I've been through 3 artistic director transitions as a staff person, right? So one of the things I think is so important is that your institutions evolve. So where you were 20 years ago when you hired your artistic director is not where you are now.
Right.
And so the idea that you just replicate the person before without taking stock of how the field has evolved, how your community has evolved, how the art has evolved, boards don't necessarily know how to frame those things from the beginning. And they really depend on the search firm to help codify it's like an institutional assessment that happens first. The first opportunity is assess the institution, assess the community. And that assessment becomes the building blocks for the job description.
Yes.
And most boards don't know how to get there without the steady hand of a search firm, which is part of why they're so valuable.
And I'll say really quickly that one of the ways that we try to center that discussion is figuring out who are the people that have traditionally been centered, usually predominantly white staff and predominantly white boards. And instead for us saying, how do we create an affinity space for BIPOC folks within this institution, both board, staff, artists, and community-wise, and actually center that in the conversation about where is the institution now? So that for me as a search consultant, when I go out there and think about these alternatives or who are the folks, I have that affinity space in the back of my head constantly. And usually, at least what I've found, you will find the truth of an organization in that BIPOC affinity group space. You will know and you will hear from people whether theaters and organizations have kept their commitments to EDIA. You will hear, some of the racism and sexism and homophobia that people have experienced within an institution. It's not to say that there are all problems there, but you get to more of some kernels of truth around what may be some of the issues and challenges that we're asking our BIPOC leaders to enter into, or any leader to enter into, and how do I then translate that as a search consultant to candidates? And what does it mean for someone like Reg to say, I want to enter this search, given the opportunities and maybe the challenges, or also saying, I actually don't want to enter this search based on the opportunity. I want to go towards a different opportunity.
Yeah. And I wonder, Reg, if you have a reflection on your experience in conversation with Mosaic, whether you found an organization that had some clarity around what their opportunity looked and felt like, whether that was the beginning of a sketch or sort of how did you feel sort of in conversation with the organization about what was there?
Yes, we are recording.
Yeah.
I say it's, you know, I really feel having so many colleagues who have been part of the seismic shift, so to speak, over the past 10 years, in a very unique position. You know, I replaced an artistic director who self-selected out, which is not often the case. And so I didn't, and we're also celebrating season 9 right now. We're preparing for season 10. And so met an organization that was younger and therefore more nimble around some of the questions around history and legacy. Identity was wonderfully ready to be reshaped. And I've met an organization that, you know, also wasn't doing a pivot towards EDI, that the core of Mosaic's mission and DNA has always been cross-cultural thinking. I think so there's so many factors that from the beginning made the organization and the opportunity different than others I had been, searches I had gone through, opportunities I had been presented. And I never take that for granted. That I met an organization that was really excited about new ideas, new ways of working. If anything, I felt more pressure to be different, as opposed to pressure to be the same as the predecessors I've had, or that the organization may have had.
Got it. So what, if you could design the process, right? So a board, and you design the process, but you guys can design now too, where a board is starting to explore the idea of a new artistic director and artistic leadership. What is it they actually need to know or engage with or understand in order to formulate the actual beginning of a conversation with potential artistic partners? So what do you need to know as the board to make this a positive and productive step?
I mean, I feel like half of it is it's that establishing what is happening in the field currently, talking about what are some of the ways in which artistic directors are speaking, you know, or the kind of work that is being done out there. You know, Hana, great director, Reg, great director, you know, who's out here in our field, trying to give a basis of might that mean if you're looking at candidates like Hana and Reg in terms of the institutional strategy or mission moving forward, the kind of work that they're going to bring to the institution. And half of it, I was saying a little jokingly earlier, but it's really serious. It's actually getting board members to talk about art. It's getting people to talk about the theater that has impacted them, you know, and why it belongs at this institution. And it's also very much understanding, especially for artistic director roles, there are, yes, artistic, I would say competencies or artistic skill sets that are needed within an artistic director. You need to curate, you need to produce, you need to have relationships with artists in some sort of way. You need to have a vision and perspective about community, even defining community within an institutional organization. Really difficult sometimes because your community changes, you know, your cities change. And so there's a lot of basis around what are the artistic imperatives or skill sets that you're looking for, and then what's also needed organizationally as well. You need to fundraise. Yes, you know, that the art is the center and, sad to say, main product of what we're trying to do within a theater organization. So that fundraising ability or that ability to be able to shape and define the art that you're making and being able to discuss and speak to it is really key for a board to understand before meeting candidates. You also have to understand the job or what it means to be an artistic director. I think Hana and Reg really described it well and succinctly. And what we try to provide our search committees and boards is to say, read some of these different articles, you know, or read some of this research about how the role of artistic director is changing or has changed. Even the model of it is changing. There are now co-artistic directorship models versus a single artistic director model. You know, so there are questions even for boards and search committees about what's the structure of the organization? Why is this the structure that you need with a co-managing partner or an executive partner? And I think the other thing that I would say with framing for board and for staff, it's almost like what our current president says, like judge me according to the alternative, not the almighty. You're not looking for the savior. You're not looking for the person that comes from on high and is perfect and gives you every single lovely, wonderful answer. And my job, I feel as a consultant and as a guide, is to give the things that they maybe see on paper or hear out of a candidate, and then also to give some of that organizational perspective, that listening perspective that I try to provide, and say, this is another side, hopefully for the candidate's sake, to say, here's actually why I have brought this candidate forward and what I'm trying to get you all to have a conversation about or offering about. But I'm curious for you all in particular, yes, folks who have looked out at searches or looked at job descriptions, or looked at different organizations, what have you often seen as the frame of what your call is as an artistic director?
I think the thing I'd offer the board that I've been most attracted to in previous searches, search at Mosaic, is honesty about who the organization is.
Mm-hmm.
I think the yes, and to looking at what's going on HowlRound American Theater articles, but also what does that actually mean for this company?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that gets shuffled away or gets overlooked and then comes up from the candidates' questions. You can kind of chisel away to what is the real truth of who we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Operationally, artistically, fundraising, fiscally, where are the savings, where are the reserves, what is the current staff structure, who is the current audience, who are we? And as honest and as thorough of an assessment as you can have, I think it's so vital for a board to lead their staff, and I think staff are vital to be a part of that reflective work. Because there's a real disconnect between the day-to-day operations of the organization, how that then leads to what the artistic director may or may not be responsible for, ultimately responsible for, not spiritually responsible for, but you will get your raise if you do X, Y, and Z things well. Your job will be met, your performance review is based on these things, managing these positions, that kind of clarity of structure, how you report and relate to the board, that kind of clarity, which only comes from staff participation in the search process. And I think at the core of the search, at the beginning of the search process, allows for a much more robust conversation during the interview process. So that's my big offering for what I would encourage a board is to include staff in a really thorough, honest assessment about where we are. And because it's an opportunity to overcome the challenges that we may face, where do you imagine this organization in 5 to 10 years through this new artistic director's leadership or with this new artistic director's leadership? Those are the two questions I've been asking in previous searches, not asking right now, Mosaic. But those are the core questions that I've always been, and that came from experience doing searches. What are the clarity of questions I need in order to know if this is a viable opportunity for me or for this board and staff? And therefore this community.
How about you, Hana?
I think going back to your initial question, I think that a board's work has to begin with an assessment and recommitment to mission. Right. So you have the mission that your organization began with, but I actually think that it's really important, at least once a decade, for the board to take a very clear look at the mission and the reality of what the organization is doing, how it's achieving its mission. If the mission is still aspirational, if the mission is still central, if that's the direction the organization is going, one of the questions I ask often, and this is a really good question, and if you guys use it, make sure you credit me for it. I ask boards when I'm interviewing, are you looking for evolution or revolution? What are your goals in this next moment for the institution? Sometimes they're looking for someone to radically shift the institution into a different trajectory, right? They've looked at the mission, they say, actually, we want to go here. We need a change agent, right? And then other times they say, we know where we're headed. We have a good foundation. It's an evolutionary journey that we're on. We need to stay close to who we've been as we evolve. That's important for me as a leader to understand, because that is going to frame how I do my work. If I walk into an organization, if I choose an organization, because one of the things that I think is really important, and this has been it shifted for me in my mind a decade ago, and I will never go back. When I go into an interview, I'm interviewing you as much as you're interviewing me.
That's right.
Right? I'm at a place in my life, I turn down 90% of the jobs that come my way, right? Because I'm like, oh, right, I get to choose the reality that I'm going to spend my life in and how I'm going to do my life's work. And I want to know what I'm walking into, and I want to know what your goals are. So if it's a revolutionary moment, if you are looking for me to catapult this organization and I choose to take that on, then I'm going to frame out the way I do my work in a very specific way. If it's evolutionary, then I actually have to have a fundamental understanding of who the organization is, what people see as connected to the DNA of the organization. I have to love that. I have to breathe that. I have to have that lead me as the backbone for my work, and then I build around it and on top of it, right, to evolve us. So I want to know in the interview process whether or not the board is on the same page. Because if half of the people are saying they want revolution and half of the people are saying they want evolution, what I know is that there is no way to succeed. Because 50% of the people will feel that you have failed them because you are not in alignment, because the board is not in alignment. And so I think those are really important things for a board to take a look at when they're going into a search. And for anyone who's in the process, understand your own power and agency, right? You are the person who will be left standing, holding the bag for the decisions that other people make when you take on that job. So know what the job is, not just what they say it is, to your point, but what it really is. And some of that is getting savvy about the questions you need to ask to understand what's underneath the first version. It's like, you know, the representative shows up. They clean up nice, they put the organization in a pretty dress, and it's just gorgeous. And it's like, I'm in love. I want to know what happens when the hair comes off and the makeup comes off and what's underneath that.
Do you have emotional intelligence? You know, it's like, you know, or you touch with things, right? You know, yes.
Am I bored after, you know? So just knowing how to ask those questions, I think it's really important to figure out who you are and why you're doing the work, and letting that lead you in the way that you approach the questions you ask an organization.
So it strikes me, so a couple of threads I'm hearing: a grounded understanding of where the organization is, and that itself feels like a mountain to climb, right? Because I had a friend who went to a theater to interview, and they said, well, we can't decide, we don't know if we're a $2.5 million theater or $1.5 million theater. And she said,
You're
can I see your budget? I mean, there's evidence that will tell you that answers that question. You can aspire to be a $2.5 million theater, but you are not a $2.5 million theater. And it's sort of the same thing as like, we care about equity and inclusion. It's like, you know, I don't see that. So a first challenge, it feels like, is for a governing board to have a grounded understanding of where they really are, which from my experience with boards is a hard thing to do in the board, and often so and then the other thing I think it's going to come back in the support conversation is we know that people, well, there's a great theory that says people have two theories of action in their head at the same time. One is the espouse theory, the theory they would say out loud that drives their action, and then there's the theory in use that actually, if you looked at their behavior, I understand that you say that out loud, but you have this other one going. And theory and use tends to be about, I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to look dumb. It tends to be more impulse. And the challenge comes up when organizations, genuinely believe they have a espoused theory that is true. Like we want revolution. And then you start the revolution and they're like, hold on a sec.
We didn't need that.
Right. So a grounded understanding also, and a real emotional intelligence of the board to say, we think revolution, but we don't know what that feels like, and we're ready for it to feel really odd and uncomfortable, or we're not ready. So I'm hearing a couple of threads in here around how you can get ready for the work. So I'm curious then about what would sort of be the next. So let's say an organization has a pretty good understanding of where they are. And I think a follow-on question for me is, I would imagine what you want is really deep clarity, but also openness to what it might become if you're entering as an artistic leader. So super clear about who we are and what we've been and what we tend to want and what we favor and what artistic practice looks like, but also a willingness to be in conversation. And I wonder whether, I don't know if you have an opinion of this, whether governing boards have an easier idea thinking of executive leadership than artistic leadership, or whether they tend to come in the same way.
Artistic leadership is executive leadership.
I mean, I
think-
it's like, I don't even say that.
Yes.
I mean, sorry, managing director, as opposed to artistic, whether there is, whether you've noticed an aptitude among boards or search committees for the managerial side of the work, or whether that's just, I'm making that up.
I mean, they're both different opportunities. You know, I think where I frame that is there are different opportunities about where the organization is going, about the values and the issues and challenges moving forward. I really say for the executive side, often there are more clearly defined metrics, so to speak, for executive directors or managing directors. It's the idea of how much money have you raised? Have you worked at an organization where you've had to be responsible for earned revenue, and what did that look like? How many staff members reported to you? You know, when have you had to make strategic choices for an institution? I think for an artistic director, what's interesting actually is that they are more emotional searches. You know, they're those things that they can't name. You know, there are things that they say, and then there are things that are like, but I can't name what I'm feeling. And what I'm trying to get at usually in both searches actually for an executive director or an artistic director are two questions. Usually I'm trying to get from a board. What is your fear? What, you know, there's a theory around, like, a lot of people operate out of some kind of fear that's underneath. So often I'm really just trying, and especially when folks like Reg and Hana show up, then you really, in the active conversation of them interviewing, hear, what is your fear about this candidate and what they would bring to the institution and what they would mean for that institution? Why is that a concern? Why are you expressing it in this way? Can I frame it to you as an opportunity? Can I frame it to you as a strength instead? You know, can I turn your perspective around? The other thing I'm asking myself often in both searches is, am I wrong for some reason? Did I get something wrong? And when you present a slate of candidates, it's a really great way to test those values, to test that idea of, is what you're saying matching what you're doing? And when you actually have flesh and blood in front of you speaking to you, that is a real clear way for people to say, yes, this is why I enjoyed this candidate for X, Y, and Z reasons. The other thing that you have to do that's important for artistic director searches in particular is being on the same page about what is required, what can be learned, and what can be developed out of a candidate. And that is often confusing. You know, they may want to hear out of Reg, for instance, he didn't say anything about raising $2 million for a fundraising initiative. And I'm like, okay, why is that important to you? You know, and they say, well, it's important that they fundraise, and our last artistic director fundraised that much. Okay, so is the number important? Is the fundraising important? Is the fact that Reg and Hana can build relationships important? What is important here about the kind of alternatives that we're presenting? So it's really a moment for me where there's a level of clarity in seeing a number of different alternatives to that organizational direction and saying, how am I wrong? Am I wrong about the assumptions that I went in around an institution that's primarily done Shakespearean work and actually is very attracted to someone or very interested in someone who is doing newer work? What does that mean for the institution? What might that mean for the art that's created? So that's some of the things in terms of how you frame those alternatives. I'm constantly asking myself as a search consultant, what am I hearing from this group? What questions are they asking? Who are they reacting to? Am I wrong about some assumption that has been core in this search that a candidate is showing me? And perhaps I have to push the search committee or the organization in a different direction. And I think you have to have when you talk about openness and clarity, you have to have clarity about what the organization wants. But even I, as a search consultant, have to have a kind of jurisprudence to say, I actually might be wrong on this point. And I've got to explore that further in order to get the best and most optimal decision for the company.
Yeah. So I'm curious about sort of the generation of alternatives, right? So how, I'm curious about the skills, abilities, background, context that you think would help sort of define the kind of leaders that could step into an artistic director position. So I know it would show up in the job, sort of the spec, but I'm curious what skills and abilities or gifts.
It's such a loaded question, and I bristle-ish at the thought, because I've been through probably 6 artistic director searches prior to Mosaic, or including Mosaic. And I've answered far more questions about my administrative leadership than my artistic leadership. And I do not think that's a fluke. I do think a big part of that is ageism. I think there is a clear idea of how old leadership is, in addition to what race it looks like and what kind of pants or shoes it may wear. I think all of those things are big factors, but I will never discount the fact that I was 29 and the runner-up was really confusing to many boards. On paper and in person, you have checked all our boxes. You actually have been trained to be a unicorn.
Yes.
Because we've been trained, we have been trained to, understand upstage, downstage, and all of the facets that go into making vibrant, successful, high quality artistic theater experiences, and how to fundraise for them, manage them, contract them, save the day. All of the business skills actually are vital to the current definition of artistic director as I've experienced, and I think many boards still imagine it to show up, which is that the idea of, which I've always thought was a fallacy, but the artist who just reads plays all day is a complete fallacy. And you even said right away, you are the chief fundraiser, you are the face of the organization, you are actually there for the lead marketing asset of the organization. And so many of the conversations I'm having are actually search consultants pushing the board to talk more about art. And because so much of it's about business and what we perceive leadership to be. So I just said to say, I wish on some days there were more conversations just about the quality of the art we all experience and why it moves us. But I find the search should become unemotional quite quickly and to become about nuts and bolts and ability to get to metrics and definable successes.
And discounting some things that are really key. I'm like, have you ever ran a rehearsal room for a large musical? Guess what? That's coaching and staff management. You may not see it that way, but that's actually a skill set that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting because this again reflects an evolution in the field, right? So 30 years ago, artistic directors, it was not uncommon for someone who had been a freelance director, who had not been in an institution, to become an artistic director. Many of my colleagues who are great freelance directors who have been up in these searches keep getting knocked out because many of our institutions have grown. You start a theater and you started like a little love bubble to make art. And that love bubble to make art it starts to grow up. And then all of a sudden you've got buildings and you have 100 staff members and you have very real responsibilities to keep the lights on. Suddenly that love bubble becomes a business. And you get to a point where I think depending, and some of it depends on what kind of institute, size, scale. I'm running one of the largest institutions in the country right now. So it's a different game than where I was in St. Louis, which was a $10 to $12 million theater, right? But this idea is that once a theater starts to have so many responsibilities, boards get a little bit scared of having a leader who doesn't have the institutional experience, right? Because we're too big for you to learn on the job. They forget the birth of the regional theater movement in that framework.
And likely the artistic director you're replacing.
Right.
Has likely been in that position.
Well, this is
since.
so this is the other challenge, is that if you look to the UK, artistic directors tend to sit in those seats for about 10 years, every 10 years, right? It's a very common thing that you leave your institution and you go back to freelancing, or you leave your institution, maybe you go to another institution. In this country, Molly Smith, the incomparable Molly Smith, who is a brilliant legacy leader of Arena Stage, was there for 25 years. The previous artistic directorship that I had was also replacing a legacy leader, not a founder, but a legacy leader like Molly. He sat in that seat for 33 years. So you have artistic directors who spend decades and decades and decades in those seats. So you're not seeing evolution in those leadership positions turning over very often. What that has meant for I would say for my generation, is a little older than Reg, but many of us sat as number twos in those seats for 10 and 15 years, rather than being able to ascend into the executive leadership seat, because the executive leaders held those positions for so long. But what that meant is that we were able to build out an incredible portfolio of institutional knowledge and experience, which makes it very hard for some of my colleagues who are brilliant artists and actually great leaders, but don't have the institutional experience to be able to compete. The other thing that is a shift that you see in terms of artistic directorships is that you are now seeing, I think it was pretty rare in the past that you would have an artistic director who did not have a traditional artistic practice, who was not a director, who was not a playwright.
Yeah, right.
Now you have the birth of the artistic producer or the creative producer.
Yep.
This is someone who is deeply invested. They may come from a dramaturgical background. They're producers, but they don't have a classic practice. They're not the lead artist of the institution because they don't direct, they don't write, but they are the lead curator. Those skill sets are firmly about leadership, institutional experience, and relationships with artists. And so, you know, I think we'll see what happens, because this is really the last 10 years that you've seen this. We'll see how this works, and whether, you know, and I have lots of friends, we have good friends who are great artistic directors who are creative producers, but don't have the kind of traditional practice. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what that means for our field, when half of the artistic directors are not the lead artists and half of the artistic directors are, and how that actually shape shifts the regional theater. It's an exciting time of possibility, I would say. But this idea that, you know, you just have to be able to pick plays was never true.
That's right.
And is less true in 2023 than it has ever been.
That's amazing. Well, I'm aware of the time and want to see if there's questions in the room. I certainly have another one. But does anybody have a question burning in their soul at the moment, or even just simmering a little bit? Yes.
I'm curious about transitions, which has not been such a long time for either one of you. You come in with at least a year of somebody else's vision and agenda. How does, I mean, how do you step up as a visionary? How do you inherit that and then make it your own?
Great. The question was around, just so if people aren't hearing it online, that around the transition of leadership. Often the season you are in is usually programmed by the leader behind you.
I actually am really grateful for the year, because it means that I just have to produce, which is the thing I can do with my eyes closed. Just make sure that that's what I've been doing my whole career, right? So my job is to make sure that Molly's vision is delivered with excellence to this community, and to start to build relationships within my own institution, get to know my staff, get to know my board, get to know DC, and really start to build my first season to meet the community, rather than coming into a community that I don't know and having to you know, do a magic trick. I'd rather have the time. And so I'm really grateful for the year of producing my predecessors last season. To the question of transition, though, I will say that having witnessed transitions and then learned so much from my last transition as an artistic director, I was really clear with the search committee before I was hired that we needed to have a transition committee, we needed to have a transition plan, and that I would be actively involved in setting that transition plan to make sure that, and also I asked for a change management specialist to come in and help
That's good.
support the board and the staff in understanding what this kind of generational change might be. Most of our institutions, change management is a science, right? And the American theater has not practiced it. And so I felt that it was really important to level set expectations, because my experience going into my last artistic directorship is that some people thought I would change the place, but no one thought that my presence and that my leadership would necessarily mean that we would change the way that we worked, that some of those practices would shift. There was an expectation that I would fit into a Steve-Wolf size box. And there was not an understanding that I was coming in a fully realized human being of my own, right? But only because they had been living in one way for 30 years. They didn't know, everyone who worked there had only worked under that leadership model. And so I thought it was really important going into an institution like Arena, which is, one of our landmark theaters in the country. Excellence is at its core. And also many people have worked there for 20 plus years. And so I wanted to make sure that we were all working with the same level of understanding that there was going to be change, there was going to be evolution, that there would be moments where it got hard, but that we would come out of it with a shared vision for how we would move forward, and to encourage people to embrace the uncertainty as we start to build together. And the board was really receptive to that. And so we've started that process. And I think it's really, really important for me working at this level to make sure that I had the pillars of support I needed to be able to do my best work. And I learned through living what those things were. I could not have walked into my first job and have known the things I know now about what I need in order to be the best artistic director I can be for an institution.
How about you, Reg?
Yeah, I would say, the evolution revolution. I think Mosaic was, I think I could say was interested in revolutionary evolution, meaning there was a real desire to keep evolving, meaning kind of stay where Mosaic has been in terms of mission. There was no question of the mission. And in fact, my 10-year start was timed with completing the strategic plan. So one of the great gifts, which I really perked up about in the interview process, was the board did not want to complete the final, nuts and bolts of strategic plan or overall vision and language around it until an artistic director was in place, which is a unique, special opportunity to really level set where the next 5 to 10 years can go. And that there was excitement to do that with me was a big reason why I was ready to hit the ground running. But it also was a real clarity that we do not want to become Arena Stage in 10 years. We want to remain Mosaic, and I was quick to name that does include a budget size. Because it took some pressure off of it. We're not trying to go from 3 million to 8 to 10 to 20. Then the actual how we achieve the mission as a team under my vision and leadership, which can at times feel revolutionary, but still be contained in the box of evolution. It actually meant the job, we didn't need to do radically new things, that wasn't the mandate. That was an opportunity. There was room to do radically new things. And then the timing also, I was producing or leading or really observing the staff in action producing a season the staff picked, not a predecessor. And there is a difference there. There's a difference in terms of ownership of that season, feelings that are attached to the choices that have been made. And interestingly, and I think I don't take for granted, a real question of should that have been the choice we made? It really allowed a unique power dynamic of, and I've gone through a search as a staff member who had planned the season, and a new artistic director came in and had to produce that season while I was still on staff. And that was moments of tension for sure, because you have to explain choices that are seem quite minute and obvious, and the way to do it in our sleepness to someone who's purposely trying to understand why you do that in your sleep and not this. And so I was also very sensitive to that for the Mosaic staff I was meeting. I was perhaps too sensitive in some cases to their feelings about their choices. But I knew so holistically what they were feeling.
Yeah.
And the ultimate thing was scared,
Mm.
because we forget that these are actually jobs.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so they're scared while going through a pandemic
Mhm.
of, will I even have a job?
Mm.
We all were scared of that
Yeah.
during the pandemic, and you're
Yeah.
doubly scared when the new person comes in
Mhm.
who has been charged by the board to help us think differently.
Mhm.
You may not be part of what thinking differently feels like. And so you're both protective and scared of the choices you made. So that's a really unique opportunity to be in. And I purposely chose observing for two reasons. One, I was still working my previous job. There was too much overlap with the previous job and the new job in terms of administrative artistic leadership life, but also my directing life, which is one of the things that I always value, the search consultant really being obvious that, again, I don't think some boards understand you are often hired 2 years out. And so I do have commitments, teaching, directing, artist relationships that I'm not willing to change. And they're actually an asset and opportunity to chew this up. So all of those, unique things made for a 6 month of sponging while actively announcing and fundraising and programming the next season.
Mhm.
And so, we don't really talk about November through February of 2022 because it was, one, I was part-time, which was not true.
Never is.
And two, and I was, and it's just, it was a really hard personal 3 to 4 months. You're building a plane while flying a plane, while also helping this other organization who you care about, and people there, you really care about their other staff members you're leaving. Kit that plane as an order as you can, while also going to be the lead generative artist in 3 other rehearsal rooms. That's a really tricky moment. Lack of a better adjective. And so I was able to be honest about that to the staff and to the board and say, I'm going to observe and put my attention towards the future. And it was 95% the right choice. There's 5% that we've now, feel better about, but then it was really tough.
So really quick, that I think the one thing with transition now that I've told a lot of boards and staff is that this is a longitudinal transition. This is a generational transition for our field, like Hana said at the beginning. And so it's knowing, listen, this isn't a 1-year thing. This isn't a 2-year thing. This is really a 5-year moment for our field. And I think for boards and staff to understand that, to say this is going to be a recovery, this is going to be a transition of its own. But don't think of it as you got 1 season and that's it. It's actually thinking, it often takes 3, 4, 5 years to even try to learn how to perfect this job. So it's telling boards, listen, this is going to be a longer journey. And this is why I frame it as a journey. It's a longer journey than just a singular year. People think the search stops when the person signed the offer and you're like, y'all are both good? Okay, great. You've done it. It's saying, no, now real work begins. And it takes even longer. And it's a harder, often climb, but it's a more joyous climb. And that's what that's what I feel I have to submit myself to, is the joyous climb that is this moment in our field. It's this generational change, and it's about supporting leaders like Hana and Reg and others and saying, you all are going to lead our field in the next generation. How can I help? And that's the ultimate question.
That seems a beautiful place to stop. So let's thank our guests for joining us. Thank you, everybody online. I hope you enjoyed our multimedia thing.
Wow.
All right, thank you all, and have a lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you all online.